The tenant just wants something sorted as quickly as possible. What they get frustrated at is if a landlord says, well, I want 3 quotes.
It's back to communication, isn't it? Answer the phone. Don't avoid an issue. Confront it. Deal with it. It's going to be a pain in the backside, but the quicker you resolve it, the happier everybody will be.
There is a level of a duty of care that the tenant has towards making sure that problems don't occur. Welcome to the All Things Property podcast with me, Simon Bacon of Preferential Properties. Every week, Ian Sadler and I will delve into all things property. We'll guide you through with friendly, no-nonsense advice. Hello again, Ian.
Hi, Simon. How are we?
Yeah, I'm all right. Thank you very much.
Good.
So here we are for another episode of the All Things Property podcast.
Yep.
And today I thought we would talk about repairs, that old contentious subject of what's the landlord's responsibility and what's the tenant's responsibility. And if ever there was an episode that people should listen to, I reckon this is it. So I want to try and clear up that classic point of confusion. What repairs fall to the landlord and what are the tenant's responsibility? So do you want to start off by telling me what you think the landlord's responsibilities are with regard to repairs?
Ooh, this is a whole episode and more, really. Well, it starts with maintaining...
Keep it short.
Okay, all right. It starts with maintaining the services, gas, electricity, all the appliances in the property.
To summarise then, structure and exterior, plumbing and heating, electrical, roofs, walls and windows, boilers, major appliances, health and safety compliances. I always think anything affecting the safety, the habitability or the building itself is a landlord's responsibility.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay. So then in terms of tenant responsibilities, what do you think they are?
Well, you can sum it up in one word, really, and it's respect for the place, the house they're living in.
Expand on that, though.
Expand on that. Keeping it clean, tidy, respecting the property, the...
Changing light bulbs?
No, yes, that's them. That's my bugbear.
Yes.
The number of times I've had phone calls from tenants not really insisting they get changed, but just not knowing the process. And that's half the problem. If they know the process and what they're expected to do, then you can erase a lot of the problems straight away. But to explain gently to a tenant that actually all the light bulbs were working in the property when you moved in, and if the lounge light bulb needs changing, it's not down to us, it's down to you.
Yeah. I think the same happens with things like smoke detector batteries, basic garden care, cutting the grass, trimming the bushes, weeding, that sort of stuff. Preventing moisture build-up. We've talked about that, I think, in a previous episode, and we'll talk about that again going forward. But preventing moisture build-up, certainly, in the winter months is really critical. And I think tenants sometimes look at that as, well, it must be a fault with the building. But I think also fundamentally making sure that they report issues early. I mean, I would sum up the tenant's responsibilities as they should treat the home like they own it, but not expect to fix serious faults. Would you agree?
Yeah, a pragmatic approach to a tenancy from a tenant's perspective is good.
Yeah.
But I think it's a lot of it is educating people. If you explain to them what their responsibilities are when they move in or on an inspection or at any time during tenancy, most tenants will accept that and be grateful for the input.
No, I agree. I think one of the things I'd like to talk about today is, we're in the middle of winter at the moment. So for me, one of the big issues is boiler repairs. How often do you get, a tenant phoning up to say, I've got no heating and hot water, I need it sorted?
Yes, that's all too common, and it can happen on the worst of days, Christmas Day, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I think...
How do you deal with that?
Well, the first thing I do is I ask the tenant if there's a boiler, an error code on the boiler. A few tenants will have already done that, and they'll have Googled the fault and can get a solution to it themselves. It can be repressurizing the boiler.
Yeah, isn't that the biggest issue sometimes, is that the water pressure's dropped in the boiler,
Yeah.
and all it needs is just topping that up. Now, is that a tenant's responsibility, or should a landlord be paying?
It's an agent's responsibility to resolve that problem as quickly as possible and without incurring excess cost to the landlord. To send an engineer out to repressurize a boiler, £75 minimum. That's, you looking at it at face value, it's completely unrealistic for the landlord to have to do that. But in some cases, tenants don't feel they should have to meddle with the boiler. No, which I get.
But to a certain extent, doesn't that come down to that, the whole issue sometimes around tenants and landlords is, if your boiler goes down in the property and you are an owner-occupier, then you have to figure it out. You have to think, what do? I do sometimes feel, and maybe this is a lack of education, that some tenants will feel, well, it's nothing to do with me. It's, landlord needs to sort my boiler out.
Yeah, they do. But if they sat down and thought about that, a more practical approach would be, how am I going to get this problem resolved as quickly as possible? That's going to require input from me to do that. Let's see what I can do. And Google's the first point of contact, isn't it? And they can often resolve that problem.
Yeah.
And if it's Saturday night, 6 o'clock, and you've got the whole weekend in front of you, or most of the weekend in front of you, then you want it resolved as quickly as possible.
You can guarantee that's when it will happen.
Yeah.
Saturday night or Sunday morning.
Yeah.
But it's a case of, communication. There's no harm in, phoning up the landlord or the letting agent to say, look, this has happened, but then for the letting agent or the landlord to say, well, this could be the fault. The first question I always ask is, what's the pressure on your boiler? And if it's no bar, then it's just a simple case of topping it up.
Yeah.
Now, that may be difficult on some boilers, but a lot of them, it's a simple tap. And, we're lucky. We have our gas engineers will often talk someone through how to do that.
That's exactly the point I was going to make. I'm not a gas engineer, so I couldn't necessarily talk somebody through it as well as a maintenance guy could. And they're quite happy to do that. They're happy with the regular level of work they're getting. So to make a 5-minute phone call to talk the tenant through the problems, all they need to know is the make and of the boiler, what the error code is, and it can be dealt with 9 times out of 10.
I think the other issue, though, the real big issue for a lot of tenants is when the boiler, the engineers come out and gone, no, the motherboard's gone or the boiler needs replacing, we can't get it up and running. Then it becomes the expectation of, or when are you going to get it sorted and how soon can you get it sorted? What have you found with that?
Well, you need to measure their expectations, don't you? Because if it was your house, how quickly could you get a boiler man out there? How quickly could you get a boiler replaced? I think we're ready pretty much for that any time, and we have a process in place that will expedite that problem as quickly as possible. And it's
Yes, but did you know that the legislation says that if you're a tenant, you should have something sorted within 48 hours? Now, for me, that's one of those issues where there is a conflict there between, why a tenant has to have that time frame when, as an owner occupier, you may not be able to get that sorted. So I suppose from a letting agent's perspective, we're fortunate. You can often get a contractor out there within, if it's an emergency, within 24 hours, and you can generally get a new boiler fitted within 48, 72 hours.
don't know about that.
Really?
Well, you've got to build in the communication. You've got to break the shock to the landlord first, and that's sometimes no easy task. You've then got to get their authority to go and do it, and then you've got to go and contact your engineer to get the boiler ordered. So I think 48 hours is a big ask, really.
I do think that the advice I often give to landlords is that whilst, things like British Gas boiler cover can be useful, the timescales for getting British Gas out there to service or to sort boiler problems out and replace can often be much longer than not having boiler cover in place and actually having access to a contractor that can be much more responsive than
Yeah, you can stay on top of the situation. If you use your own contractor, you can communicate with them anytime you like. With British Gas, it's not always easy to maintain that level of communication.
And that's one of the things I actually say to my landlords is, think very carefully about whether or not having boiler cover is worth your while to have, because the responsiveness of using approved contractors can often provide a much swifter service and almost provide a better service to the tenant than just say, well, it's British Gas, so we're in their hands and having to do that. Important. I mean, we had the issue recently with a boiler that went down, and it was interesting just trying to conform to the regulations, which is you need to be providing suitable alternative heating, so portable heaters, and making sure that the tenant is very aware of the timescales for doing the works. Boilers tends to be a real issue at this part.
Well, they're expensive items to repair, aren't they?
They are very. Okay, what other kind of issues do you think are big ones as far as landlords are concerned?
From a maintenance perspective, showers.
Yeah.
Always a big one. My shower is running hot and cold. There's no consistency in the temperature. It's a straightforward job to fix. But if you're a tenant without a shower for 48 hours, then you're going to be at the sharp end of the problem. But fairly easy to resolve, but a fairly common one.
Leaks.
I don't like leaks.
No, neither do I. Neither do tenants.
Leaks can be a real issue, can't they? Because we had a problem in one of our properties a while back, and it was the engineer had gone to change the boiler and change the system that the property used, and after they'd left, water started pouring through the lounge ceiling, and the contractor went back and ended up cutting out 2 inspection holes in the floors on the landing. And what had happened was the compression joint had never been put under sufficient pressure with the old system. When the new system changed, it burst the joint and water started dripping through the ceiling. But that's the blessing of a good contractor is somebody who's prepared to put that level of effort in to find a problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing, isn't it, just how far a small amount of water goes, how much damage it can cause.
Finding the source of that leak isn't always easy.
No, especially in flats, because that then becomes even more difficult, because that becomes,
insurance.
an insurance, but also if water's coming through from the flat above, you've got the issues of, again, first thing you've got to do is the tenant needs to go upstairs and mention it to the person in the flat above. So access can often be an issue, and that's for me is where we often struggle sometimes, is that a tenant will say, oh, I've got water coming through my ceiling in a flat, and it's, well, have you been upstairs? Have you spoken to them? Well, no, I haven't done that. That's your responsibility. So it's just trying to get to that point where tenants also recognise that they have a responsibility too. If there's water coming through the ceiling from the flat above, then they do need to, have that conversation in the first instance, so that person actually knows upstairs.
If it's going to speed up resolution of the problem, then they should be or want to be as proactive as possible.
So in terms then of things like this, what do you think the lessons are for landlords to how to make sure that relationship between them and the tenant can, be maintained to its best?
It's back to communication, isn't it? Answer the phone. Don't avoid an issue. Confront it. Deal with it. It's going to be a pain in the backside, but the quicker you resolve it, the happier everybody will be. And if you resolve an issue quickly, whether you're an agent or a landlord, if you deal with a tenant to get it resolved quickly, you develop a level of respect from that tenant, and the relationship between agent or landlord and tenant becomes a lot easier.
No, absolutely. I think for me, a couple of lessons that I would encourage landlords to consider is, if your boiler goes down as an emergency and it needs replacing, the tenant just wants something sorted as quickly as possible. What they get frustrated at is if a landlord says, well, I want 3 quotes, and you end up spending a few days getting quotes. Sometimes I think it's really important for landlords to be pragmatic and accept the speed at which they get it done will determine, the comfort that the tenant has in terms of how swiftly and how well major issues are dealt with. It's fine if on a routine inspection the contractor's saying that your boiler is on its last legs and you probably need to think about replacing it. That's the time to go and get the quotes and be prepared. I also think from a landlord's perspective, sometimes it's best not to wait for it to fail and to actually have in place a mechanism whereby you're starting to think, well, yes, that boiler is going to be needing replacing soon. Do I, as a responsible landlord, think about getting it done, and how best do I accommodate that? It gives everybody then a way of planning, rather than everything having to be as an emergency when issues can be much worse. I think moving on then to some of the tenant kind of responsibilities, how do you, if a tenant phones up and says, I've lost all my electrics have gone, what would your response to them to be?
I'd ask them what any symptoms of the problem were, find out as much as I could first, and I'd ring my electrician. I'd ask him to ring the tenant to talk him through, to make sure that it wasn't something that could be simply resolved, rather than having to make a trip to the property. Just go through the process of talking about the problem and then levels of dealing with it. And you can deal with it with a phone call, or you have to go and visit the property, but working out your end game.
Yeah, I always find that if we get a call from a tenant saying my electrics have gone, first thing to do is to check the fuse board. Make sure that try and identify, is it one specific item? Is it the light switches? Is it the plugs that have blown? Or is it the whole fuse board that's blown? Also then encourage them, once they've done that, to then unplug all of their appliances, because often the simplest thing is the toaster's caused a blown fuse, which has then tripped the electrics, and it is a simple case of unplug everything, put the fuse board, switch the fuse switch back up, and if it stays on, plug each individual appliance back in, see which one blows, because often it's just a simple fuse in a plug that has blown the electrics. And that's about self-help, and that's where I would always encourage tenants to do that before they pick the phone up, so that if it is something more, then obviously I always find it reassuring if I say to a tenant, well, have you checked the fuse board? Yes, I have. Have you unplugged all your appliances? Yes, I have. Well, have you then flicked the switch back up? Does it work? Yes, it does. Okay, then it's an appliance, and we can identify it. If it's obviously electrics, we don't expect tenants to understand electrics, but the same as anyone in their house, they just want a quick resolution. So the more understanding a tenant has as to how to deal with very simple issues, I think that also gives the landlord a level of comfort as well, that that everybody is on the same page, rather than it being, oh goodness, my electrics have gone, I'll phone the letting agent or I'll phone the landlord, I'll expect them to send a contractor out to fix it. Often it's very simple. It's a bulb that's blown, that's tripped the fuses, or it's an appliance such as a toaster or a kettle or a washing machine that has blown, and that's caused the issue. You unplug it, you switch it back on, everything's fine, and the cause is identified, and you know how to be able to resolve that. blocked drains. Go on. You must have experience of that.
Yeah, recently as well. Not a pleasant story, this one.
Go on then.
Property over in Telford, single mum, lovely lady with an 8-year-old son, just the two of them in the property. The raw sewage is backing up through the toilets. Fortunately, in this case, the landlord had home serve cover, so you stress the fact that it's a single mum, child, need help as quickly as possible. And to be fair, they worked really well. They were there the following morning. They did the uncomfortable job of unblocking the toilets, blew through the drains out the back and solved the problem. But that's, that can be a really...
Landlord's responsibility or tenant's responsibility?
It's wet wipes. Don't start me on wet wipes. I think blocked drains are usually caused by things being put down toilets that shouldn't be put down toilets.
Fat build up in sinks.
Yeah.
Stuff going to toilets that shouldn't go in, like wet wipes,
etc., etc.
Yeah, exactly. Now, is that a landlord's responsibility or a tenant's responsibility? How do you deal with it?
Okay, same thing. A blocked sink. My sink is backing up. Now, you and I would put a bottle of drain block down that sink, and on a regular basis, maybe once every 2 months, to keep it running freely. I think maybe you could get away with the first time that happened in the property. Maybe the landlord would pay for that to be done by a contractor. But then when the contractor came back to say, well, it was caused by just a build-up of food, etc., then you have a phone call with the tenant, you educate them on that aspect of the drainage, and hopefully you won't get a problem again.
And I think that's right. I think from a landlord's responsibility, the first time it happened, it probably is a case that, the landlord meets that cost. Ongoing issues should be, educating the tenant. And if it continues, then really that is the tenant's responsibility to get that sorted, or to pay for that to be sorted. Not necessarily get it sorted, they'd still come to us, but the cost of doing that would be down to them. And that is a classic example of, again, where if you put things down the sink or the toilet that you shouldn't put down, it is going to block, and it shouldn't be the landlord who is responsible for that. That's where the sometimes education, but also awareness from the occupier of the property as to what's fair and reasonable. And I think the way I'd like to end this is to say, in terms of repairs and maintenance, although we've talked about exactly what are landlord's responsibilities and tenants' responsibilities, there is a level of a duty of care that the tenant has towards making sure that problems don't occur. And the landlord also has a duty of care to the tenant that when an issue is reported, that it gets sorted quickly and speedily. And I think, again, overarching all of that is good levels of communication.
And education.
Absolutely. So, really, to sum up this episode, hopefully we've explained what are landlords and tenants' responsibilities. We've talked through a couple of issues and set out some generic guides for, how to deal with issues. And I think an understanding prevents fewer disputes. Please do share this episode, not only with anyone who is renting or letting. It does save future arguments. And if you would like to talk to us about your property needs, or want a valuation, or want to talk about renting your property out, please give us a call. Thank you for listening. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the All Things Property podcast. If you found this episode useful, don't forget to subscribe, like and share. These things really help us reach the people who need to hear this advice. See you next week.